Okay, so we are back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have a guest who I've been looking forward to have on for quite some time, Ayishat Akanbi, who is a fashion stylist. She's also a writer, cultural commentator. She'll tell us more about what she does, but first of all, thank you so much for coming. I've been very much looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a long time since I've had a public discussion, and you very much felt like the most comfortable place to do it.
Yeah, and we've been talking for a couple of years now, I guess, because I found you, I think on Instagram, somebody reposted something of yours. I reached out and we started sharing ideas, having conversations. And I'm really struck not just by the content that you put out, but really your way of perceiving the world, your way of perceiving people. I mean, you have a real attention to just, I would say to humanity, to like these nuances that I think get lost in the discourse and the ideology that overtakes so much of the way we frame social issues. And it's refreshing to find people who want to pay attention to those details and parse them out. So, I mean, that being said, tell us a little bit about your own personal background, how you got into the work that you're doing, and then we can talk about some of your more recent Substack posts.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. It's always refreshing to me and encouraging, more so. Yeah, it's always encouraging to me when anything I said has landed with people whose work I also really respect and who I think are coming at thorny issues in a thoughtful way.
Mhm.
So I feel like I stumbled into cultural commentary. So I've been a stylist for a very long time now, maybe about 15 years. I started when I was in my early 20s and I was interested in menswear. I had a style of my own that maybe people thought was quite eccentric. And I recognized all the ways it was somewhat disarming to people. And what I mean by that is the way that I presented myself made unlikely people speak to me. And I realized how, wrong or right, a change of outfit can really change the doors that are open or closed to you.
Mhm.
And I really was quite fascinated by that. Um, didn't quite know what I wanted to do in life, but I knew whatever it was, I couldn't necessarily have regular employment. Not necessarily because I didn't want that, but I just seemingly am unemployable outside of the things that I know how to do. Um, and so, yeah, I always knew that I had to work for myself. And people were often interested in my style, and I began styling others. So Labyrinth, many years ago in 2010, is a producer who's now actually based in the US, was my first client. And I began styling him, and he was signed to Simon Cowell's label, which was called Psycho at the time. And they would work with a lot of people who were on the X Factor, which I think, I don't know if you had that in the US,
We
but
have
I
an
think it's like,
American version, yeah.
yeah, I thought you had an American version, yeah. And so, yeah, I started working with people who were coming from that show, and then that expanded to others just through word of mouth. And I guess in many ways, to be a stylist is to pay attention, fundamentally, and it's to be, or it's to pay attention to trends. And so it doesn't surprise me too much now that, I guess I'm paying attention to trends within the culture.
Mhm.
Um, and I had some things happen in my life. So it was 2012, and my brother passed away. He got stabbed, and something like that happening can really sort of change, or at least for me, it really changed the way I thought about things. I was very eager, maybe even desperate, I would say at the time, to kind of understand human behavior. Why do we do what we do? It struck me that this person who had done this to my brother would have probably been able to tell himself a story that made the act justifiable. And then I became very interested in the stories that we tell ourselves to make unhealthy, negative, destructive actions possible. Um, and I felt as though if I could understand how we get to those places, I wouldn't necessarily have to, whether that's take them personally or I don't know, just be as anguished by them as I could be. I think there's something in understanding that can be very liberating. And so, yeah, I think, once you've tried to get your head around one of the most heinous acts, everything else from there is a lot easier. And so at a certain point, I I think I noticed certain narratives becoming popular and mainstream that seemed to me to be out of sync from at least my reality, from the way that I saw things. And it felt like a lot of people were adopting ideas just because they sounded good or they were trendy, or, I could see that there wasn't much thought put into them. Um, and yeah, I didn't really have much people to talk to about that. I think at the point that my brother died, I became um, really heady in a certain way. I thought about things a lot more. And being from a creative environment where most people, if not apolitical, are progressives, I just didn't have many people to talk to about the things that were troubling me. And I felt quite alienated in the creative world that I was in. And so I started using Twitter. I think almost as kind of like, I often think of it like a fishing rod, putting something out into the world and seeing what comes back, seeing who are the people like me, or who is wrestling with these kind of things, whatever it was. I think it was much more of a way of connecting with people and meeting people. I never necessarily expected that it would attract the following and attention that it did. But I do think at a certain point during this period of, let's say, a mental shift, a profound mental shift, I think I realized that I wanted to write because writers had helped me. Writers had helped me feel a lot less alone. And plus, I was having a lot of thoughts that I didn't know what to do with. So, yeah, that's how I started putting things out on Twitter. And yeah, that received the attention of various thinkers, writers, journalists, and podcasts. And I think I put something out. It was in 2018. A channel called Double Down News got in touch with me about a tweet or something like that. And Double Down News is like a socialist channel,
Mm.
and they have a big following. And yeah, they wanted me to talk about, as they all called it back then, woke culture. And I spoke about how I thought it was replacing a certain compassion with just I don't even know what I said, but there was some maybe neat way that I put it that they wanted to explore more. And that video ended up going viral. And that is how I think I began meeting other people who felt similarly.
Wow. And so, I mean, you have recently started up a Substack, and the first post was about a book deal that you ended up not going through with. And I think the logic behind it, how you explained the story was fascinating because you don't really hear people, you really hear people giving up on potential book deals, but also, the reservations that you expressed. I mean, show that like there's something deeper you wanted, and that this deal you felt like was going to compromise it. So, I mean, tell people who haven't read the post, like what happened with this deal? Why was it that you felt like this wasn't going to be something fruitful for you ultimately?
Right. So I think at a certain point, while I was, my following was increasing and things like that, I think I knew that people might be reading me in a way that I wouldn't describe myself. So, I never saw myself as a political commentator, that's for sure. Um, and I understood that I'd reached similar conclusions as a lot of people, but maybe for very different reasons. For me, this wasn't about saving the West or anything like that. It was about ideas that people get into their head that are psychologically unhealthy.
Mhm.
And I believe that we all are much more capable than we know. And I think there are a lot of stories and ideas that we tell ourselves that can alienate us from who we really are. And I think it's important to discover that thing. And when we discover that thing, I also think we realize that we have a lot more in common with people than we could have anticipated. And for me, that was a really, yeah, it was a massive shift in my outlook by recognizing that. And so I wouldn't say I was uncomfortable with the attention that I got, but I just knew that, you know, people, yeah, many people just weren't reading me in the way that I'd hoped to be. I never necessarily considered myself anti-woke. I don't really identify with a political label. There are many parts of me that some people would describe as, a typical lib. There are some parts of me that are maybe socially conservative. Um, but either way, I don't really find much usefulness in a lot of those labels. Um, and I really wanted to write because, what was always very important for me um, was trying to persuade people who had bought into a lot of ideas that I found to be destructive. It was never about getting a pat on the back from people who already agree with me, and possibly agree with me for many of their own nefarious reasons. What was always encouraging to me is when I would meet someone from the left, or someone who considered themselves an activist, who was like, "I didn't know you could think about it in that way." And that's what was encouraging to me. And so,
Mm.
beyond everything else, writing a book is just very difficult. Um, and I struggled with it just because of the difficulty that's just inherent. But also to write a book around race and gender and other elements, that were big in maybe what we call the culture wars, to write it thoughtfully and sensitively, not in a way for, I don't know, uh, the right wing to just jump on and be like, look what this person is saying. But I don't know, to write it with heart, um, yeah, it was just difficult. And in that time, I think I very much saw a change in the alternative media space. It felt like, although, people may have subscribed to different ideologies, for me it very much felt like the mentality was the same. And so I think, even though my time online had largely been positive, which is unusual for someone putting out things that are unpopular, but I think it was something in the way that I expressed my ideas. I very much am a firm believer in the idea that you can say anything you want, actually, but you can't say it any way you want if you want to be heard, or not even heard, but listened to. If you want people to just, to listen to you rather than just hear you and project onto you, then you really have to take care with the way that you write things. And I felt as though a lot of the alternative media scene um, had just kind of become, in many ways, a mirror image of a lot of what they critiqued. And I found it to be really quite ugly and really quite dark. And I think in some ways I might have had less patience for it. In fact, I do have less patience for it because the way that I view it is, a lot of progressives and activists are often young, not all of them, but many of them are young. And I think it's a youthful rite of passage to go through life when you're young and be quite wide eyed and have fairly simplistic ideas about how the world operates or how to change and fix things. However, a lot of people in the alternative media space are professors, they are much older, they have PhDs, and yeah, they're a lot more intellectually sophisticated, you might say.
Mhm.
And so for me to see them devolve into the same lack of emotional depth and, yeah, just all out childishness, I found really difficult. Yeah, I found really, really, really quite difficult. And I think, you can also learn from other people's mistakes. And even though I was getting, yeah, I think I was trying to say this before, a lot of my time online was fairly positive. But even still, then I also thought there's something strange and potentially warping about coming online every day and having people tell you how great you are.
Yeah.
Having people tell you that, they think your ideas are brilliant and this and that. I could feel it was doing something to me
Yeah.
that wasn't wasn't comfortable. I'd often come online and I'd only have one post in mind. And then, I'd get a lot of attention and all of a sudden, like compulsion, something takes over
Mhm.
me and I'm starting to say way more than I ever set out to. And even just that very act, and again, it wasn't like I was being critiqued or, I was getting pylons, but just something about it felt deeply unhealthy. And I think that has, whatever that thing was that I found unhealthy has transpired. I can now see that in so many commentators, pundits, public intellectuals. Um, and yeah, it just, this was more than, a critique about wokeness. And I think because my book had the title The Awakening from the publishers, and this was also because, the book in many ways was part memoir and me talking about how the life experiences that had led me to certain ideas around gender and race. Um, so it was kind of like a play on words. But I thought with just it having woke in the title would put it in a lane that to me had become deeply unserious. And I didn't really want that.
Mm.
So, I can't say that, this was just this noble kind of, me sticking to my principles and walking away from a scene that I found to be unhealthy. It was also that it was difficult to write. And I found that really hard.
Yeah.
And that took a lot from me. All of a sudden I had a lot of self doubt and I was doubting myself, yeah, quite profoundly. And I just felt like I needed to take a step back and to really think about how I wanted to approach these things. And I think when you get a lot of momentum or traffic online, those around you can have this mindset of go, 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 maximize, maximize, maximize. Um, and yeah, it didn't feel right to do that. I don't
Mm.
want to contribute to, as we often refer to it now, just a lot of, online slop. And although I thought, I hoped to write a thoughtful book, I just didn't know that it needed to be packaged in this way. So I think a book will happen eventually. I don't worry about that element too much. I just I needed to be emotionally and mentally prepared for what comes off the back of that. As much as I've put myself out there, I can't say that I thrive on the attention. I can't say that I'm quite a shy person, generally speaking, which is why it's probably taken us so long to actually get this conversation actually happening. Um, and so, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I was internally in the right place. And I don't know if I was. And seeing the landscape kind of devolve into what it now is, yeah, also just aided the decision and made me not feel bad about walking away.
Yeah, so I mean, there are two levels that I mean, two things that I really found most fascinating about your post and ultimately this decision, this course of direction you went in. Like, first, you recognize through this kind of moral discernment that, you know, you saw that you were at risk of compromising your own dignity, your personhood, that you were going to be like warped into this online slop, as you said, and this cycle of applause of positive attention, which is it's great for your career, but ultimately, like, what does this do to your soul, to your conscience? It's rare that you see people willing to make such sacrifices in the name of the maintaining their conscience, but also just on the level of discourse. It's interesting because like you see so many people who have genuine questions or concerns about, the quote unquote woke kind of ideology that's overtaken public discourse. But as soon as it becomes an ideological reaction, as soon as it becomes about opposing wokeness rather than fostering, real curiosity and diversity of thought, it ends up getting co-opted back into this matrix. Like it's kind of I think the resistance to the status quo becomes neutralized as soon as it becomes an ideology of its own. So like I don't know. I mean, I look at people, someone like Jordan Peterson, who's a smart person, had really interesting questions and concerns. Then he ends up becoming this kind of icon of anti-wokeness. He ends up working for the Daily Wire. And you see he compromises himself. Like you see that he's no longer able to ask questions that speak to a broad array of people, but now he's like, he's speaking to the anti-woke crowd. And I mean, it's a relief to me to see people like you who, yes, like you have questions, you have reservations, you have concerns, but you don't want to be co-opted into that ideological
Yeah,
space. Yeah, yeah, go
it's
ahead.
it's funny. I remember all of the people that I think are not necessarily what I would describe as intellectual, but wise. everyone that I considered wise, and maybe there was a handful of people on
Mhm.
Twitter that I would have ascribed that to, they all left. No, yeah, they all left. And I remember there was a woman that I was really inspired by on Twitter at some point, and she was really active. She didn't really talk about politics, but she had deep insights.
Mhm.
And they were always really, really moving to me. And, again, she didn't get much pushback or anything like that. And sometimes, because like I said, even though I had a positive time on Twitter and things like that, I always understood there's something here that's being fed that doesn't feel healthy,
Yeah.
And I often thought about this woman that I observed online. We followed each other, and I thought she knows this. I could tell from her insights. I
Yeah.
was like, she definitely knows this. I don't even know how to put my finger on it, but whatever this thing is that we're feeding or looking for, I know that she knows it's unhealthy.
Yeah.
And then I remember in 2019, she left the platform. She decided to leave.
Mhm.
And I remember getting really, really emotional about this. I think I cried. In fact, I know I cried.
Mhm.
And I cried because, like I said, she was probably one of the only people that I, there are people who are, let's say, knowledgeable, intellectual, and have a lot of interesting facts, that are less commonly known. But again, like I said, there was so few people that I could just call insightful.
Yeah.
And she left, and we had each other's numbers at this point, and I had to ask her, why she left, because in her leaving, it was confirming something I already knew, and I think that's why I was emotional. I think I was ignoring this thing, I was ignoring how distorting this thing could be, even if it was just the fact that, think about it, there are so many people who are fairly prolific on Twitter who
Mhm.
struggle to write anything long form
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, who struggle to write anything long form. And because maybe they're so used to kind of this immediate validation that they get on Twitter. And when it comes to actually writing now, where you don't have any of that, they've almost disabled themselves, by getting addicted to this, immediate feedback. And so I asked her, why she left. And there was a bunch of, really insightful reasons. But one of them that she said is like, Twitter is like almost like crack for existential loneliness,
Yeah.
and I don't know, it just stuck with me. And so, yeah, a lot of people that I admired, I think, yeah, left. And I think they were very aware. I would never say that she was compromised or anything like that. She never appeared to be, at least. But maybe by her own standards, by her own standards, I think she knew the place in which she was talking from or tweeting from, and it maybe wasn't as clean as she wanted it to be. And so she did something about that. Um, and yeah, I think that was always in the background as well for me, which kind of made it easier to kind of step back. And also, as I said, I think when you're confident in what and although my confidence wavered with the book, I don't doubt that opportunity will happen again when the time is right. But in the meantime, yeah, I just, as you were saying, as soon as this thing kind of becomes an ideology, just like maybe what those who be described as woke would do, finding ways to be outraged. I remember
Yeah.
following libs of TikTok at one point. You remember libs of TikTok?
Yeah.
At one point,
And
libs of TikTok was kind of humorous to me. It was amusing. And I remember through lockdown, it eventually just became less and less so. And it was just, from my eye, it was just cruel. And it was boring as well. And it was repetitive. And it was just, I don't know, where is the insight here? Yeah. And I think maybe that's just what I was losing. I didn't find much that was insightful apart from, everything that you were doing, hence why, you're one of the few Substacks that I read, and encourage others to read because, yeah, you're just coming at these things in a very different way. And I think when you're in the business of wanting to persuade more than just,
yeah.
I don't know, rile up your base. Yeah, it's important how you present things, and I just think you have a great way of doing that. Sorry, I kind of went a bit
Thank
around the
you.
houses with all of that.
Yeah. No, but I mean, but I have to say, like, for at least for myself, I see how, yeah, I mean, there's that temptation to play into the reactionary bit because it's it's kind of fun, but it gets attention, as you said, it gets applause, but um, pure reactionary discourse doesn't have substance because it is a reaction to something else. Like you're not presenting something new into the discourse. It's just that thing is bad, it's dumb, I don't like it. Okay, but what are you saying? If that's all you're doing, then you're not really contributing anything. And like I see how I have to be cautious not to play into that too much. I mean, I think of course, there's space for a little bit of playfulness and, having some fun with things. But no, like I have to ask, like, well, okay, what am I, is there something of substance I'm contributing in this post, or is it just self-indulgent? Is it just trying to get clicks? Um, but I mean, I do want to kind of go into the Substack posts on therapy and I mean, it's kind of hit on things that I've been observing with, again, like the kind of, I hate using the term, but the kind of like woke ideology that, I don't know, like I think on like a theoretical, philosophical level, like, okay, you can recognize there are certain flaws within, the kind of ideology that wokeness encompasses. But I think what you hit on in that post are the questionable psychological tendencies that I think that kind of ideology encourages or enables. And like I see it in certain friends that I have that like people that I went to college with who are really indoctrinated with this mentality. Like I see how, as you say in the post, it enables this kind of um, like excusing behaviors that are dysfunctional, that are manipulative in the name of, I don't know, like whether it's social justice, like amplifying certain minority voices or protecting my peace, protecting my boundaries. Like it becomes this cop out, this excuse from having to engage with you know, with something that challenges you. Like rather than saying, okay, well, I disagree with your point of view or your argument for X, Y, and Z reasons, it's you're gaslighting me or that's hate speech. Therefore, I can completely dismiss you and your argument as morally bad, as toxic, which is, I mean, ironically, which is a very manipulative move in itself if you're just going to shut down any argument you don't like because and I've had run-ins with friends who disagreed with something I said, and I may have actually been wrong, but it wasn't on the level of like, I don't like what you said because X, Y, and Z reasons. Here's my disagreement. It's you are hateful, you are this, therefore I can't even engage with your idea. And I was just like, wait, so there's no conversation here then. Like you're right, I'm wrong, the end. Like it's a really insane power move to make, but it postures as, very righteous, very, defending the vulnerable, whatever. So I don't know, like I appreciate that you're trying to call attention to the fact, like, wait, psychologically, there's something questionable about this kind of mentality. So I don't know, tell listeners a little bit more about what you were trying to get out in that post.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the social justice or the progressive ideology and mentality that's been prevalent in the last decade is um, everything you would imagine a good psychologist would tell you not to do, not to think, and it's interesting to me that at the time where therapy has kind of become is thought about as a cure-all, we're
Mhm.
also in many ways like the most psychologically unhealthy we could be, and it tends to be people who have this what I would perceive as a psychologically unhealthy worldview who promote therapy as the cure-all. And you hear things like, you know i'm I'm not prepared to date anyone who hasn't been in therapy, and things like this. Yeah, it just seems, again, for one, it's elitist. We can't all afford therapy, and even still, I just don't think there are actually. I'd go as far as to say there are some conditions that you can have where therapy can actually be quite counterproductive. I think about a lot of people that I know who their mental health issues for whatever reason. give them a very skewed view of reality. And lots of mental health conditions can do that. Depression can do that. Anxiety can do that. But let's say if you BPD, borderline personality disorder, for instance, can do that. But let's say you're dealing with any of these things in quite a chronic way. Um, you know, you can then go to your therapist and uh, tell them this very skewed version of events. And unless they're a very good therapist, and many aren't necessarily. And it's not even that they're not. I think a lot of therapists, I was talking with a therapist just last week, and she has many troubles, all the same troubles that I do, because, she's told me that she has been trained on this affirmative model,
Yeah.
you know so
Mhm.
even if this patient or client is saying something that the therapist knows sounds a little bit off, people want to keep their jobs, and
Exactly.
so they're incentivized to just affirm whatever the client is saying. Um, and also, again, but even if they're not going to do that, unless the therapist is very probing, yeah, they're just going to therapize them on a situation that never happened, or didn't happen in that way. And so I do think in many ways, even the way that we use boundaries, that term, I didn't actually mention that in the post that I wrote about therapy. But there is something, again, I've never been able to put my finger on it, and I've really wanted to. But we're using the word boundaries, but we mean something else. I'm not exactly sure what that thing is, but every time I hear people saying often to me, like, it's about boundaries, or like, I'm just respecting my boundaries, or you're not respecting my boundaries, there's a word that would be actually much more fitting that they're not using. And I never know what it
Mhm.
is, but it doesn't feel like this is a boundary issue. I think, many people, for one, we have the issue of people just pathologizing existence,
Yeah.
in general. I have a lot of, traits that would definitely come under the neurodivergent umbrella. Um, and I don't know, I just feel, for the most part, I can function. For the most part,
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know how healthy it is
Mhm.
to see myself primarily, even if I have, sorry, we froze for a second. Are you still
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
me?
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So even if I have a lot of traits that correspond to a diagnosis like ADHD or autism,
Mhm.
or something like that, I don't know. I think primarily seeing yourself through this is troubling in some way. I think you start to not know where personality begins and diagnosis begins, and things like that. Um, I just, yeah, it just feels like we are trying to give ourselves psychological reasons, or use the language of therapy to justify just shutting down reality. I had a friend recently, or a friend of a friend, who's a quite a thorny character and quite a difficult character. Um, she didn't want something to happen. And so she described this thing as, well, if you bring this person around, I'm going to feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And so by the time that you've said unsafe, this is kind of like a checkmate.
Yeah.
Once you say unsafe, then, you're really daring someone. You're
Yeah.
daring someone to say, well, okay, because if they challenge you, you know, to the person who believes that they are unsafe, they're essentially saying to them, you want to enact some kind of psychological violence on me. You want to harm me. You want to be destructive onto me. And so, yeah, as I think what I'm very interested in attention to is that all of these patterns of behavior, as you said, are deeply manipulative. They're all the things that we accuse others of
Yeah.
doing, the gaslighting and all of the, and again, I'd use these terms very sparingly, but
Mhm.
actually in these contexts they're really quite fitting. Um, and so I don't know, it feels like in so many ways we're taking on a worldview and an ideology that corresponds with personality disorder.
Yeah, so this is where like my issue with the whole anti-woke discourse comes in because when people say like I feel unsafe, I feel triggered, blah blah blah, like they're expressing a legitimate feeling. Like if you're a victim of sexual abuse and you're in a particular environment or like someone starts talking about rape, like I totally understand why you're uncomfortable. Like you have every right to. My concern is when this becomes like a hardened position. Like as an adult, you have a responsibility to try to work through your issue. Perhaps you're not prepared to, like, you haven't reached that level of maturity yet because of your woundedness, because of your fears, whatever it is. Okay, like maybe you do need to step away. But what's concerning is this, like, again, the hardened position, like, I am entitled to step out of this situation because I'm triggered, because I feel unsafe. And you must respect that, or else. You must like, you must respect this as a normative kind of approach, or else. No, I mean, you have every right, like if you're not at that place yet, to step away, fine. But like you should aspire to grow. You should aspire to come out of that position of immaturity or insecurity and deal with the real world like everybody else does. And I think, and yeah, it's the same thing applies with like mental health labels. Like plenty of people can find characteristics within themselves that fit whatever category. Like lots of people have spectrum-y traits. Lots of people have ADHD type traits. Some people have real autism or real ADHD. Um, which again, it's like I think the appeal of adopting a label is I've absolved myself of the responsibility to do something about it. Like even someone who has really ADHD should be seeing a therapist, should be on Ritalin, should be doing something so that they can function in the world. And then once in a while, they may need special accommodations, fine. But like, I think there's something very appealing of saying, well, my agency is no longer in play. You know, I'm totally free to do whatever is easiest for me. And this is where the problem with that, like the therapist comes into play because as you're saying, like it's a transactional relationship. You're paying this person for a service. Contrary to a real relationship with a friend, with family members, with community members who are going to hold you accountable because like you're in relationship with them. Like if if you're doing something that bothers them or that hurts them, like they have real skin in the game, so they're more likely to call you out than the person you're paying to give you therapy. And I think that's where I lose the anti-woke kind of thing. Because it's like, sure, lots of people are being irrational and using the woke stuff to excuse idiotic behavior. But the solution is not to be like, mental illness is fake and people need
Of
to
course not.
man
No.
up and take responsibility, lift yourself by your bootstraps. That's not the solution. I think the solution is to to reestablish these communal, familial ties, which is not going to be established by like anti-woke kind of discourse.
Right. And,
Um,
and to
yeah,
be fair, a lot of those anti-woke people probably need the therapy
yeah,
that they are, they're kind of warning others off. Um, but no, it's exactly that. So, the piece was called Beyond Therapy because
mhm,
it's not a dismissal, it's a way of therapy. It's things outside of therapy that we can also do that could be beneficial for our ill states of mind. And so for me, I think I listed like mentoring and support
yes,
groups and spirituality and friendship. And part of the reason perhaps as well as to why we've come to over rely on therapy in so many ways is maybe an indictment of modern friendships in so many ways.
mhm,
I'm often sometimes speaking to just strangers. Often, I'm quite friendly and I'm curious. And curious was a word that you brought up earlier. And I would say, if I'm motivated by anything, I I tend to speak out and feel I feel a way about anything that stops us from being curious.
yeah,
I feel a way. Yeah, I'm upset by that. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Sort of, yeah. It incenses me enough to yeah to speak out about it because yeah I think curiosity again can be massively freeing um, and it's just interesting as well and I think if we were much more curious about each other,
mhm,
again, I can hear someone listening to this and saying, well, your friends are not therapists, they're not skilled and they're not trained and stuff like that. But, a lot of therapy is just being curious about someone, asking questions, not necessarily going into every interaction that you have and just trying to prove
Yeah.
something about yourself, but trying to learn something about someone else. So just a simple, why do you think that was? What do you think that says? Where do you think that came from? Just having the
Yeah.
patience to do that,
But in
because a lot
order
of the,
to, yeah, I
sorry,
was just gonna
go
say
for
that in order to really ask someone those real, because like they're the friendships where people just like categorically validate everything you say, like, oh, because I respect your feelings and I affirm. But like when you really love someone and you've proven it through the way you treat them, like there's a little more freedom to challenge and say, hey, like where do you think that's coming from? Or like, do you really think this was the best way? Like to me, when a friend is willing to push back against my kind of snowflake complex, not in a violent, aggressive way, but in a
of
way that
course.
like is clearly out of their love for me. Like I respect them more than the friend who's like, yeah, yeah, whatever you say, of course you're right. Of course I validate your feelings. Of course your feelings are legitimate. No, not all of my feelings are legitimate. Sometimes they're dumb. But
Yes, and this is exactly what I say.
yeah,
No, a lot of
yeah.
my feelings need to be invalidated. A lot of them actually do need to be
But
invalidated
you
because
have
they're
to
unhealthy
risk.
for me.
But like that's what I'm saying. Like if you really love someone, you have to take that risk of hurting their feelings a little bit. Um, but I mean, that being said, like, you mentioned all these different types of relationships that could really benefit a person in a way that maybe a therapist, a professional couldn't. And I'm wondering, like, are there particular friendships or like mentors you've had who have really helped you to grow and who have challenged you to look at yourself more deeply?
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, I don't have friendships that exist on the surface,
Hmm.
you know. Not really. I mean, if I have any friendship that exists on the surface, we just know each other. I wouldn't necessarily call them a friend, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I actually met someone. So for all the issues that Twitter has, I met, lots of now close friends on Twitter. One man in particular, his name is John. He's from Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And he's like in his, I think, maybe mid to late 50s. And
Okay.
he's a writer himself, PhD in philosophy.
Wow.
And how we kind of got to know each other was, I don't know, I would say things. And again, I was curious and I didn't necessarily even understand where so many of the thoughts that I was having were coming from, but I was able to articulate them. And sometimes he would just reply and say, this sounds like, you know, X writer or this thinker or blah, blah, blah. And then I would look into that person and get familiar with their work. And, we eventually became really close friends. I would say he's one of the most active friendships in my life.
Wow.
And so I run everything by him, everything. And I come to him with, where is the holes in this? This is what I'm thinking. So sometimes I can have thoughts that don't feel really bleak, but they feel very honest, bleak in a way that
Hmm.
may not be healthy. I mean, sometimes you could have a bleak thought that is true. But if I see myself kind of leaning into an area that feels quite bleak, I might say to him, here is how I feel about something. I don't know if I should feel this way, but it feels very honest.
Yeah.
Tell me the holes here, like challenge me on this type of thing. And he'll do that. And yeah, and I would say, I have maybe about two or three other people in my life who, yeah, are exactly like that. And maybe that's why, I'm not currently in therapy. Again, I would never write it off. And there might be points in my life where I need to seek that out. And I would happily do so without any shame or anything like that. But I think because I have these types of friendships and I have them with strangers as well, it's sometimes much easier for strangers to open up to someone that they don't know as opposed to their friends because there's no expectations.
Yeah.
And so, I allow a lot of people that I meet in my life the same space. And I think in doing that, you often see the thing that you're struggling with is not so unique. And even that is, has its own sort of healing proponents, if you like. Um, so yeah, I think my life is angled in such a way, or that I don't feel like I need that, which isn't to say that I'm completely healthy and I have no flaws and like everything I do is right. It's completely not. But I have people who, yeah, will challenge me that I can talk these things over. People for whom there is no sort of emotional labor. They feel no emotional labor in having to listen to me. Um, and vice versa. So Yeah, and there are thinkers. There's people online that I still really respect. Helen Pluckrose is a friend, and in some ways, I would call her a mentor. She's on Substack. You should check her out.
Okay.
I have a friend called Laura Kennedy, who again is like has a doctorate in philosophy, and I just really appreciate her approach to a lot of difficult issues. There are so few people I tend to find who can approach these things without, as we've said, leaning into the reactive thing. And she does it really well.
Mm,
And so we may not speak all of the time. She's much more someone that I admire. But, we're friends, definitely. But still, just having them as an example, yeah, has been very beneficial for me. So yeah, I am thinking, at some point, because I wrote about it in the piece, support groups and things like that. And yeah, at some point, maybe I'm thinking of starting my own for something, to help
mm,
people and where
yeah.
we can facilitate these kind of conversations. Because for me, there's no point in doing all this stuff online if it's not going to manifest in the real world, in
Yeah.
reality somehow. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's really a big thing for me.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, kind of a side note based on your therapy piece. So you mentioned Dr. Melfi and Tony Soprano from The Sopranos, and so you did you end up watching the whole series?
I did. So
Yeah.
by the time that I wrote that piece, I just finished watching it. And yeah, I was, it's probably very feminine of me, but yes, the part of the show that gripped me the most was the relationship between Tony and Dr. Malfi. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, like my when The Sopranos came out in the late 90s, I was still, a kid. And I mean, I should mention like The Sopranos is like stuff that hits very close to home because it's happening in North New Jersey, Italian Americans, like that's the world that I grew up in. Not in the mafia, of course, but we have people who know people, as we say. But yes, like my family, all of my family watched it as a kid, but I was too young. Like I would pop in the room to like see a scene, but then they'd be like, okay, you got to get out because you can't see some of this stuff. And I ended up never watching the whole series until recently. I decided, I need to sit down and watch from beginning to end. So I haven't finished yet. I've gone pretty far, but I also am, in addition to being fascinated by seeing like North New Jersey Italian American culture on screen, and like it's also fascinating how it's shed light on a lot of my own family dynamics that I have not previously understood. Yeah, the dynamic between Tony and Dr. Melfi really is fascinating on so many levels. I don't know. Could you just like say a little bit about what it is that fascinated you about that part of the series?
Yeah. Well, I think I was also fascinated. I mean, Tony's quite resistant to therapy, but at the same time is
Mhm.
reliant on it and against his maybe better judgment sometimes. I think he's ashamed of it, but also he finds such relief in
Yeah.
this practice in this dynamic that he has. But I'm also very curious about Dr. Malfi because you know she's she's very interested in him, and I think she's interested in him in a way that might go beyond the realm of professionalism. And there's this sense and maybe this feeling that there is some kind of underlying romantic tension between them. Beyond that, I just think Dr. Malfi, her outfits and her, I just think she's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
And I just think she's impeccably dressed. But yeah, it's just her wrestling with herself, when it comes to Tony. There is as much as we've spoken about curiosity, and maybe I will touch on this in Substack at some point. I think there's an element of curiosity that can be pathological at points. There
Yeah.
might be there might be a curiosity that is unhealthy to some degree, and I think maybe at points I have been there, and maybe that's why, because on so many levels, I think Dr. Malfi understands that she may not be helping Tony. She may, and this is the suggestion as you get closer to finishing the series. She starts to really reflect on, how much of this dynamic they have How much is it about, actually wanting to help him, and how much is it about her and whatever fascination that she has, and, the quiet ways in which she is flattered by Tony's attention, and she knows that, he desires her, sexually and things like that. And there's something in that is appealing to her, also against her better judgment. And so I think the way that Tony, um, there's these scenes where, Dr. Malfi is, talking about Tony's relationship with his mother. And, as much as the relationship between him and his mother is really fraught, and that's putting it lightly, it's a deeply unhealthy relationship in every way. Um, but any suggestion that maybe she wasn't, the greatest mother to him, he immediately pushes back on. And I think it's something I can recognize as, coming from an African background.
Yeah.
And yeah, family is everything. This suggestion, even it's very counter to how we would think about things today. You think about a certain kind of millennial or Gen Z in therapy, and they would completely eat up the idea that their parents, completely messed them up. That would be an idea that's very appealing and seductive to them. But in Tony's generation and the culture that he comes from, this idea that maybe, our parents have done anything but just tried to help us in the ways that they understood how to. Any suggestion that it could be sinister or anything like
Yeah.
that is completely repellent. And I just find that contrast with how, we are today to be interesting. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I think it also, just Tony just being a man, and the resistance that a lot of men have. We see it online. There's this kind of idea that men don't need therapy; they just need to, especially from the right or the alt right, or I
Yeah.
don't know, the post left, whatever you want to call it, the dissident right. Sorry, is the word that I was looking for. Is
Yeah.
that men just need to go to the gym? They just need to go to the gym, and they just need to, I don't know, be active in some sense. I don't know.
Yeah.
Tony's relationship with Dr. Malfi, I don't know, would suggest, again, it's fiction, but still, I think a lot of men do actually need places where they can talk. And again, I think there's a level where it can be unhealthy, because I think a lot of women who do therapy and talk to their friends constantly, I think it can very easily slip into rumination, and maybe that's why women tend to be on average more neurotic than men, because we bury into our feelings maybe a bit too much. But yeah, I don't know. I think the whole show is fascinating, but definitely that element for me is just worth watching it for.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I like it's interesting seeing how much, like I was saying, I understand my own family dynamic better, in part because my my father and his siblings, my grandparents, grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in these Italian enclaves that no longer exist, where that like strong Southern Italian sense of family loyalty, that's this tribalism that you would do anything for the family, even kill people. You do anything even for your sister who you hate, like
Mm,
that you have to defend your I don't know, your sense of honor. Like this was foreign to me growing up in an assimilated suburb where, there were Italians, but we weren't immersed in the culture the same way my father was. So there was like these psychological rifts that like he would do things and I didn't comprehend where that was coming from, and I would feel like, it was hostility. But eventually, like I think like the show helped me to see that no, like we're growing up in two very different environments. And what you're saying about your own background and how like, there's this kind of like progressive elite impulse to blame your parents for all, screwing you up. There's an interesting scene in the Hulu series Rami. Have you seen Rami?
I haven't. No, maybe I should.
It's another New Jersey based TV show, but it's so this time it's an Egyptian Muslim family in Jersey City, New Jersey. And there's a part where the main character's sister goes to therapy, and this like white, upper middle class therapist convinces her that her mother completely screwed her up. And she like starts saying this stuff to her mother, and she's like, "Don't you realize I came to this country and sacrificed everything for you? So like, sure, maybe I was aggressive, maybe I yelled at you too much, but like, are you gonna totally negate everything that I did?" So you see how like again, there's this kind of elitism in that.
Right, right. It's so funny. I remember I was talking to a friend once. I was having some issue with my mother, and yeah, I was telling this friend about it, and he was like, "Oh man, I'm really sorry." And I said, "Oh, no, you don't have to be sorry. Why are you sorry?" And he was like, "Because your mother doesn't love you." And I was like, "What?" Yeah. And I was like, I was really taken aback. But he said that because in his framing,
Yeah.
anything less than a mother being completely accepting and approving and validating, again, it comes from this kind of Western way of, because that's how I think. My mum came from Nigeria. She came from a village. She didn't have much extended family here. And so, yes, of course, the ways that she's parented me has impacted me. And some of that impact has not necessarily been the most positive. But this idea that, I don't know, that was just done out of carelessness
Mhm.
or anything like that, I really, really struggle with. And yeah, I think there's a lot of, although I know you said that, I don't know if you were saying that you didn't necessarily resonate with the family loyalty, the ties in which are kind of represented in The Sopranos, but I do think there's probably something really quite similar in at least my experience
Yeah.
of my Nigerian culture and what family means and things like that,
Sure.
and what I saw represented, yeah, in The Sopranos.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting how, yeah, like you see certain parallels between certain cultures and anyway. So okay, so that being said, I did want to ask you, because like this has come up in our conversations, like the role of spirituality. And you've said that like you've grown up with, family who is religious and you've come to develop your own views. And you also said in the therapy piece that, yeah, like spirituality, religion can be something that helps you grow, that challenges you to develop emotionally and so on. So I don't know. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about, yeah, like the role that spirituality has played in your own life, how you've come to make sense of certain questions about religion and whatnot? If you
Mm,
feel
yeah,
comfortable
so
sharing, yeah.
yeah, sure. So my family is Muslim, and I grew up in an Islamic tradition, but very loosely.
Mhm.
I don't know how to speak Arabic and things like that, and there was no real rules, like Islamic rules kind of like enforced on me, apart from, we didn't eat pork in the house. My mom's never drank alcohol. I still don't really drink alcohol, mostly just because I don't like the taste and I don't like the feeling. I don't like the feeling of being drunk or anything like that.
Mhm.
But I never, when I was young, sometimes like family friends would take me to church, and
Okay.
I wouldn't mind, and in fact I would actually quite enjoy it. I think when I think I've always been fairly philosophically minded, if you like. And by that, what I mean is I've always asked questions. And, as a child, when I'm hearing that there's a heaven and there's a hell, and if you don't do certain things, then you'll end up in this place, I took that seriously. That
Yeah.
wasn't that wasn't small to me. I think I remember, it probably would have horrified my mum if she knew, but I think there was times in church where, that you were asked to raise your hand if you wanted to be like born again or something like that. And I would do it at like 8 or 9 years old.
Wow.
But again, I kind of, throughout school, I kind of slipped away from that. I hung with the popular kids, religion, spirituality wasn't anything that we spoke about. I grew up in a place called Southampton, and it was mostly white. And I don't know, my experience, at least in the UK, is, most of my white friends are not religious. My black friends, yeah, are Christians, Muslims, or, the South Asians that I know are Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever.
Mhm.
But yeah, the average English person that I know, um, the white English person I know isn't religious. They might go to church, for special occasions, but religion isn't necessarily, in my experience, something I've known them to hold very dear. So yeah, it never meant much to me um, until my brother passed away, and at that point, I remember my mother and father, who are, Muslim, as I said. uh, they obviously, they were, grieving and, traumatized, and this was unfair to them. Everything that happened to my brother was really unfair. And I really understand that emotion. Of course, you're somewhat out of control in those moments. But I remember thinking to myself, they're religious. They're meant to believe. Maybe I don't know how. I was young at the time. I was only 24, but I understood in that moment they couldn't take much comfort from religion. They
Mm.
couldn't take. It didn't seem like they could take much comfort from religion, from this thing that is inevitable. Maybe not the way in which my brother died, but death. Death is inevitable, and I could see in those moments that religion didn't provide, and even long after it didn't provide enough of, I don't know, some sort of security for them.
Yeah.
And so, knowing that people are going to keep dying in life, and tragedies are always going to happen, what is that thing then? If religion doesn't necessarily grant it to you, and it can, but let's say at that point where I was, what I saw around me, okay, religion doesn't necessarily grant this thing to you. So what can help me deal with tragedy, with emotional pain, and all other forms of like anguish?
Mhm.
And that was a central question that I had. And I remember going through something, and again, I'll definitely write about this at some point, but it's really quite otherworldly. But I remember not long after my brother dying, it could have been a year later, it could have been 6 months, but I remember going through a deep psychological transition, that for about 6 months made me feel as if I was on acid, or
Mm.
LSD. Yeah. I've never taken anything like that
Yeah.
before, but from all of the symptoms, or the traits, or qualities associated with taking those kind of drugs, that is exactly how I felt for about 6 months. So this incredible newfound love of nature. I could literally look at trees and burst into tears, all of a sudden, being able to see myself in everybody else, even people who've done the most heinous things,
Mm.
elements of me. There just didn't seem to be a separation between me and other people. It was in this time that I started speaking and thinking differently, almost out of nowhere. And it was just a very deeply spiritual experience. Um, and yeah, it changed me. It allowed me to know there is this other side of being alive, that is really powerful and transcendent, that we can arrive at on our own. We can arrive at without any sort of altered states of drugs and all of this type of thing. I hope that there is a way that, and in fact, I know that we can get there. For me, maybe tragedy induced that. But, I know other people who have experiences of a similar nature, and it's not always tragedy. I think, personally a lot about, yeah, is there how we can access those states. But for me, I think once you've seen something like that and experienced that kind of from nowhere, um, it's hard to dismiss the role of the spiritual. And I think in a time where we live, where our every indulgence is, encouraged. I don't know. I really see a beauty in people who have guardrails, who
Mm.
truly want to improve morally. And I think religion and spirituality, yeah, can just hold you accountable, in ways that very little can. And it could give you just these moments of transcendence, that I think are really deeply changing. Um, so again, I wouldn't say that I have a religion, but I am, I'm religiously curious, let's say. And
Mm.
it's not uncommon for me to go to a church service sometimes, or to listen to gospel music, or to learn more about Islam and things like that, especially the Sufism side of things.
Yeah.
I yeah, I take a lot from this, elements of many religions, Buddhism, or different forms of spirituality, Rastafarianism. I think I've just kind of got an amalgamation of my own thing, and I know how that sounds to a lot of people, but yeah, I'm not too worried about that. But essentially, um, this is what keeps me wanting to um, live in alignment with my highest ideals. And maybe, yeah, and that's maybe what I think spirituality and religion can give you is, yeah, that thing that makes you want to live in alignment with your highest ideals.
Mm,
And I think it's a shame how on the political left, I think Kamal Palia made this point at some point. I don't even know if I can paraphrase it, but I think she's right when she says something about how there is this very immature view in
yeah,
large parts of the political left, at least when it comes to Christianity.
yeah,
Every other
yeah,
religion, kind of gets a bit of a pass. But
yeah,
forms of Christianity, we just see as archaic and backwards. And I think, yeah, I think there's a massive loss there. We lose a lot. I don't think it's the most mature view.
yeah.
No?
Yeah, no, I mean, Paulia's point that it seems like the mainstream left has chosen to make an enemy out of religion, especially Christianity, because sure, like Christians have done some really bad stuff in the history of the world, but again, there's this they kind of choose to overlook the innovations, the innovations in the name of human rights that Christianity has contributed
Right.
to the history of the world. But also her point that like if you want to promote multiculturalism, you have to teach world religions. Like you need to know about the religions of the world, even if you don't practice them. But anyway, to your point though, like I I've written a couple times about Islam on the Substack, and as much as I'm not Muslim, I think there's something really fascinating about this idea that God is completely transcendent, like this sense of like the I have a sense that in Islam there's the majesty of God, who is so beyond, so much greater, which, whereas in like Christianity, we have the Trinity, like God reveals himself in a human form, which makes him more relatable. But there's something really fascinating about the sense that there's a being who is so much above, so much beyond, that really like speaks to what you were saying about the therapy stuff that like the like ideology of therapy speak and therapeuticism, whatever, like there's nothing that's beyond you and your feelings. And if you acknowledge that there's a being that's so much greater, in a way, it's liberating because then you're not a slave to all your subjective whims. And especially like in the Sufi tradition, that um it affirms both the transcendence of God, but also like the internal depth of the soul that like it's not that like I think it's nice that like you're able to complement like your internal feelings or subjectivity with the objectivity of some greater being. I think the Sufi
Okay.
tradition really captures that well.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. Even yesterday, sorry, just a quick
mhm. Yeah,
anecdote. Me and a friend were meant to go to the screening, and we ended up being in the wrong place. And there was this group outside. It was a really hot day yesterday, so there was this group outside playing cards, and they had all these snacks. And there was like a black girl who, let's say, in terms of her look, probably seemed like the kind of girl who, I don't know, likes Cardi B, Beyonce, that kind of thing.
yeah,
There was a white guy who maybe, and she was probably in her like mid-20s. There was a white guy who was maybe in his 40s. There was there's a woman in her wheelchair. Basically, it was this eclectic mix of different ages and races and things like that playing, and it looked really wholesome. And I said to my friend, I was like, this must be a religious group. And at one point they could see that we turned up at the wrong place, and they asked if we wanted to play cards with them. And we had to go to wherever this actual venue was. But I asked them what they were doing, and they were a faith-based group, but they kind of welcome atheists and people of different faiths, and they invited us. And I got their details, and I probably will sit with them and talk
mm,
at some point. So they play cards, and then one of the guys reads a scripture, and they talk about it, and they talk about how they
mm,
can apply it to modern life and just the reality of living. But just what that group looked like, I couldn't at this point where we're so racially divided, where so many people who identify or consider themselves queer feel like they can't be in straight spaces. There are just all of these kind of points of division. And this group was just so unlikely if it hadn't been for Christianity. I just couldn't imagine in any other context where this, eclectic bunch of people who are so different would just be sat together, kind of playing cards. And it just all of their differences from what it looked like from the outside just completely evaporated, and they were all there because of a common sensibility or a common belief. And it was just beautiful in a way I just don't see anymore, and that to me is like the power of religion, of faith, to kind of penetrate these ideas of, well, you're a cis white straight male, therefore, as a black female, I cannot relate to you. And, oh, sorry, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, just because a call came through on my
Okay.
phone and it came through the laptop as well. Sorry about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was just a beautiful thing to see. And yeah, I would spend time in those kind of groups. I don't feel, although I may not have a religion, I just feel very at home amongst religious people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean and just to kind of tie everything together, like you can see how this is where you see that there's something true within, again, like the kind of woke diversity kind of stuff, the DEI stuff, that there is a desire to celebrate all these differences, trying to bring people together. Does it always succeed in accomplishing that? No, but I think like especially religious folks should affirm like, yeah, there's something true about this. And like I do think people who believe in some kind of spiritual transcendent entity can have something to offer to the public discourse in this way because there's something unifying about those types of beliefs. There's something that can bring together a white person, black, queer, whatever, disabled, um, which is much needed today. Um, but so that being said, I mean, yeah, I'm very happy that we got to do this because there's I love that there's so much depth in the questions that you're asking. Like, there's this real substance, like we said, this curiosity that is, I feel, kind of rare nowadays. So of course, I'm gonna suggest people check out your Substack. But are there any, I don't know, like, is there anything that you would want to leave our listeners with? Is there like a thought, a question, or like a recommendation you want to wrap us up with?
Um, I don't know. I always feel, as trite as it may be, because we're always talking about social media and the ways in which it affects us negatively. But I don't think just because we talk about it a lot that we should overlook it. When I think about the amount of people who seemingly have lost themselves to the algorithm, um, it's frightening, because I guess I think to myself, well, where are the adults in charge, and so I don't know. Again, if I'd known you would have asked me this before, I would have maybe thought
I
of
should have
something a little
prepared
bit
you. Yeah.
neater. No, it's fine. But yeah, I think just like me, I think when I this person left Twitter and I got emotional because it confirmed what I knew, I think, yeah, if you feel this thing, shifting you, even if it's the attention that you get is positive, I think if you feel this thing shifting you in some way that you know to be unhealthy, I don't think you should ignore it. I don't think you should ignore it. I think I'm very interested in the idea of how we resist, let's say, the zombification of our souls,
Mm,
in this digital age, and now that we have, the power to even outsource, our thinking to various forms of I don't know. I think resisting that zombification or robotification, if you like, whatever seems more fitting, is going to be much more challenging.
yeah.
But I think it's the essential work. It's the essential work. So yeah, uh, I don't know. Yeah, let's resist the zombification of our minds and souls.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. So yeah, so let's leave it at that. Ayisha, thank you so much for coming on. And I hope that the conversation will be continued. And so,
Yes, it will be. Thank you. Thank you for having me.